HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, by Elizabeth C. Economy. Read by Joanna Perrin. Preface. China's rise on the global stage has been accompanied by an explosion of facts and information about the country. We can read about China's aging population, its stock market gyrations, and its investments in Africa. We can use websites to track the air quality in Chinese cities, to monitor China's actions in the South China Sea, or to check on the number of Chinese officials arrested on a particular day. In many respects, this information does what it is supposed to do: keep us informed about one of the world's most important powers. From the boom and bust in global commodities to the warming of the Earth's atmosphere, Chinese leaders' political and economic choices matter not only for China, but also for the rest of the world. And we can access all of this information with a few strokes on our keyboards. Yet all these data also have the potential to overload our circuits. The information we receive is often contradictory. We read one day that the Chinese government is advancing the rule of law, and hear the next that it has arrested over 200 lawyers and activists without due process. Information is often incomplete or inaccurate. In the fall of 2015, Chinese officials acknowledged that during 2000 to 2013, they had underestimated the country's consumption of coal by as much as 17%. As a result, more than a decade of reported improvements in energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions were called into question. We are confused by dramatic but often misleading headlines that trumpet China's every accomplishment. More Americans believe, incorrectly, for example, that China, not the United States, is the world's largest economic power. It is a country that often confounds us with contradictions. The challenge of making sense of China has been compounded in recent years by the emergence of Xi Jinping as Chinese Communist Party General Secretary, 2012, and President, 2013. Under his leadership, significant new laws and regulations have been drafted, revised, and promulgated at an astonishing rate, in many instances challenging long-held understandings of the country's overall political and economic trajectory. While previous Chinese leaders recognized non-governmental organizations from abroad as an essential element of China's economic and social development. For example, the Xi-led government drafted and passed a law to constrain the activities of these groups, some of which Chinese officials refer to as hostile foreign forces. In addition, contradictions within and among Xi's initiatives leave observers clamoring for clarity. One of the great paradoxes of China today, for example, is Xi Jinping's effort to position himself as a champion of globalization, while at the same time restricting the free flow of capital, information, and goods between China and the rest of the world. Despite his almost 5 years in office, questions abound as to Xi's true intentions. Is he a liberal reformer masquerading as a conservative nationalist until he can more fully consolidate power, or are his more liberal reform utterances merely a smokescreen for a radical reversal of China's policy of reform and opening up? How different is a Xi-led China from those that preceded it? I undertook this study to try to answer these questions for myself and to help others make sense of the seeming inconsistencies and ambiguities in Chinese policy today. Sifting through all of the fast-changing, contradictory, and occasionally misleading information that is available on China to understand the country's underlying trends is essential. Businesses make critical investment decisions based on assessments of China's economic reform initiatives. Decisions by foundations and universities over whether to put down long-term stakes in China rely on an accurate understanding of the country's political evolution. Negotiations over global climate change hinge on a correct distillation of past, current, and future levels of Chinese coal consumption. And countries' security policies must reflect a clear-eyed view of how Chinese leaders' words accord with their actions in areas such as the South China Sea and North Korea. As much as possible, I attempt to assess the relative success or shortcomings of the Chinese leadership's initiatives on their own merits. In other words, I ask, what is the Chinese leadership seeking to accomplish with its policy reforms, and what has it accomplished? I begin with Xi Jinping himself and lay out his vision for China and its historical antecedents. I then dive into 6 areas the Xi government has identified as top reform priorities: politics, the Internet, innovation, the economy, the environment, and foreign policy. In some cases, there are competing interests and initiatives to tease out. Nonetheless, taken together, these separate reform efforts provide a more comprehensive picture of the arc of Chinese reform over the past 5 years and its implications for the rest of the world. I conclude the book with a set of recommendations for how the United States and other countries can best take advantage of the transformation underway to achieve their own policy objectives. 1. Introduction. In mid-November 2012, the World Economic Forum hosted a breakfast in Dubai for several dozen prominent Chinese scholars, business people, and government officials. The Chinese had traveled there to discuss pressing global matters with their counterparts from around the world. I was one of a few non-Chinese citizens at the breakfast, and soon noticed that the attention of most of the participants was not on climate change or youth unemployment, but instead on the dramatic news from home. After months of suspense, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, had just revealed the membership of the Politburo Standing Committee, PBSC, the 7 men selected to lead the country for the next 5 years. Strikingly, most of the Chinese at the breakfast could say little about the new leaders, in contrast to the American and other democratic political systems, which are designed to strip bare the political and personal inclinations of public officials. The selection of Chinese leadership takes place almost entirely behind closed doors. It combines a bargaining and bartering process among former top leaders with a popularity contest among the 200 or so members of the Communist Party who comprise the powerful Central Committee. The run-up to this particular selection process had been particularly fraught. It was the first time in 2.5 decades that the General Secretary of the CCP had not been hand-picked by Deng Xiaoping, the transformative leader of the country from the late 1970s until his death in 1997. Deng had led China out of the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution and set the country on its historic path of economic reform and opening up. Since the mid-1980s, he had anointed each of the CCP's previous 4 general secretaries, Hu Yaobong, Zhao Zuyong, Jiang Zemin, and finally Hu Jintao. Without Deng's imprimatur, the selection process appeared not only opaque, but also at times chaotic. One top contender, Bo Xilai, the charismatic head of Chongqing and son of one of China's original revolutionary leaders, Bo Yibo, had fallen in scandal during spring 2012, eventually landing under arrest for corruption. Xi Jinping, the heir designate and eventual winner in the political sweepstakes, had disappeared for a period of 2 weeks in September, giving rise to a raft of rumors concerning his fate. Until the group of 7 men walked onto a stage in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing shortly before noon on September 15, 2012, the Chinese people could not state with complete certainty who would be leading their country. When I asked the Chinese at my table what they made of the new PBSC members, they pointed out that overall they appeared to represent the older, more conservative element within the party. 66-year-old former Guangdong Party Secretary Zhang Zhejiang, for example, possessed a degree in economics from North Korea's Kim Il-sung University and was known above all for his poor handling of the early 1990s SARS epidemic and his repressive approach to the media. In contrast, 57-year-old Wang Yang, Zhang's dynamic and reform-oriented successor in Guangdong, was left waiting in the wings. He was selected for the still prestigious but less powerful Politburo. Beyond such generalities, however, my Chinese colleagues could say little. Indeed, Xi Jinping, who at 59 years of age now stood at the apex of the Communist Party as General Secretary, and would just 4 months later become president of the country and head of the military, was largely an unknown quantity. Despite 3 decades of government service, Xi's accomplishments, temperament, and leadership qualities remained a question mark. The Xi Vision. The new General Secretary did not leave the Chinese people or the rest of the world wondering for long. Speaking at a press conference shortly after the new leaders made their appearance at the Great Hall of the People, Xi outlined his priorities. He spoke of the need to address the endemic corruption that plagued the Communist Party and to ensure that the party served the people. Fighting corruption would soon become the signature issue of his first years in office. The essence of Xi Jinping's vision, however, was his call for the great revival or rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Reflecting on China's 5,000 years of history, Xi referenced the country's indelible contribution to world civilization. At the same time, he acknowledged that efforts by successive Chinese leaders to realize the great revival of the Chinese nation had failed one time after another. The rejuvenation narrative is a well-understood and powerful one in China. It evokes memories of the country as the Middle Kingdom, demanding tribute from the rest of the world. China as a source of innovation, creating paper, gunpowder, printing, and the compass. And China as an expansive, outward-facing power, with Ming Dynasty Admiral Chang Ha commanding a naval fleet of more than 300 ships and sailing throughout Asia to the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. Left out of the rejuvenation narrative, but etched deeply into the minds of many Chinese, are those periods of Chinese history that evoke shame, such as the 100 years of humiliation, 1849 to 1949, when China was occupied and invaded by foreign powers, or the periods that remain the black holes of contemporary Chinese history, in which the Chinese people suffered at the hands of their own government, such as the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and the Tiananmen Square massacre. During his tour of the Road Toward Renewal exhibition at the National Museum of China just 2 weeks later, Xi again underscored the theme of China's rejuvenation, calling it the greatest dream for the Chinese nation in modern history. The site of Xi's speech at the National Museum was not accidental. While much of Chinese history is marked by revolutions, political and social upheaval, and discontinuities in leadership and political ideologies, the museum celebrates the ideal of continuity in Chinese history. Quoting from both Mao and ancient Chinese poets, Xi used the museum as a backdrop to make clear the linkages between an imperial China and a China led by the Communist Party. In the following months, Xi elaborated further on his vision for the country. He equated his call for rejuvenation with the Chinese dream, Zhengguomeng. For Xi, the Chinese dream was premised on the attainment of a number of concrete objectives. China should double its per capita GDP from 2010 to 2020. It should have a military capable of fighting and winning wars, and it should meet the social welfare needs of the people. There also should be no doubt concerning the country's ideological future. Xi declared, "The selection of path is a life-or-death issue for the future of the CPC. We should unswervingly uphold socialism with Chinese characteristics. The superiority of our system will be fully demonstrated through a brighter future." To this end, a robust Communist Party at the forefront of the political system was of paramount importance. Xi was also careful to distinguish the Chinese dream, rooted in collective values, from the more individualistic American dream, noting that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is a dream of the whole nation, as well as of every individual, and that only when the country does well and the nation does well can every person do well. Not all Chinese shared Xi Jinping's particular understanding of the Chinese dream. Some argued that the Chinese dream was a dream of political reform or constitutionalism, in which the Communist Party would not be above the law, but instead would be bound by it. Others said that it was a dream to better Chinese society through improvements in food safety or the quality of the environment, and still others, drawing on the American dream, called for individual dreams and pursuits to be respected. Over the course of his first year in office, Xi began to incorporate some of these other elements, such as opportunities for better education, higher income, and a cleaner environment into his dream narrative, yet it remained at heart a call for a CCP-led China to reclaim the country's ancient greatness. Xi is not the first modern Chinese leader to use the theme of rejuvenation to remind the Chinese people of past glories in an effort to bind them to modern China. Deng Xiaoping talked about the invigoration of China, and his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, both called for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Over the course of more than 3 decades, as China experienced a dizzying period of economic and political reform and opening up to the outside world, all of China's modern leaders sought to build a China that could reclaim its place as a global power. Yet in seeking to realize this common vision, Xi and the rest of the Chinese leadership have parted ways with their predecessors. They have elected a way forward that largely rejects the previous path of reform and opening up. Instead, there is reform without opening up. In a number of respects, the leadership has embraced a process of institutional change that seeks to reverse many of the political, social, and economic changes that emerged from 30 years of liberalizing reform. The Chinese leaders have also shed the low-profile foreign policy advanced by Deng Xiaoping in favor of bold initiatives to reshape the global order. These dramatic shifts reflect in large measure a belief on the part of Xi Jinping that China at the time of his ascension was at an inflection point. The post-Mao era of reform and opening up had yielded significant gains, double-digit growth for more than 2 decades, and international admiration for China's economic and other achievements. Yet as Xi rose up through the party ranks, he also had a front-row seat to the mounting challenges facing the country. The Communist Party had become corrupted and devoid of an ideological center. The provision of public goods had fallen dramatically behind society's needs, and even the economy needed a new infusion of reform. In the eyes of Xi, nothing less than dramatic revolutionary change could save the party and the state and propel China forward to realize its full potential as a great power. Xi's inheritance. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, the Chinese leadership had just begun the process of recovery from the political strife, social upheaval, and economic impoverishment that marked much of his quarter-century tenure. Xi Jinping himself had experienced some of the worst of Mao's excesses. In the early 1960s, his father, a leading revolutionary figure and former vice premier of the government, was branded a traitor and jailed for his bourgeois background. Soon after, 15-year-old Xi was sent down to a remote village where he labored for several years on an agricultural commune. Rather than feel bitter toward the Communist Party for his family's difficulties, Xi became determined to join the party, applying for membership multiple times before finally being accepted in 1974. And in 1975, when Premier Zhou Enlai set out the 4 modernizations – agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military – to begin the process of revitalizing China's economy and society, Xi Jinping began his own journey alongside that of the country. He returned to Beijing that same year as a worker, peasant, soldier student to study chemical engineering at Tsinghua University, one of China's most prestigious academic institutions. Xi's university education during this time, however, was still shaped by Mao's revolutionary impulses, with significant periods of time devoted to learning from farmers and the People's Liberation Army, as well as studying Marxism, Leninism. Only in 1977, with the reintroduction of exams for university entrance, did academics begin to reclaim a more dominant place in Chinese university life. The deaths of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in 1976 were followed by a brief and bloodless power struggle that resulted by 1978 in the ascension to power of Deng Xiaoping. Deng and his supporters cemented the 4 modernizations as the direction of the country and initiated a wholesale reform of the country's economic and political system, a transformative process that Deng would later call China's Second Revolution. In the early 1980s, the Chinese leadership began to relax the tight control that in one way or another had defined China's economic and political system since the 1950s. In the economic realm, this signaled the beginning of a transition from a command to a more market-driven economy. Deng devolved significant economic authority to provincial and local officials, removing political constraints on their economic activities and diminishing Beijing's ability to influence the development and outcome of these activities. China also invited participation from the international community in China's economic development through foreign direct investment and trade. By 1984, the government had opened up 14 port cities along China's coast to foreign investment in special economic zones. In the mid to late 1990s, the state began in earnest to dismantle many of the state-owned enterprises, which had been the foundation of the urban economy, to encourage the expansion of private and cooperative ventures, and to energize the rural economy through the development of smaller-scale township and village enterprises. The result was dramatic. Average growth rates that exceeded 8% annually for more than 2 decades, elevating hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty and earning China significant respect internationally. Jiang Zemin, who assumed the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1989 and President of the country in 1993, further elevated the role of the private sector in the Chinese political system, actively welcoming successful business people into the party for the first time. China's turn outward to the rest of the world also expanded. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Jiang, along with Premier Zhou Rongji, encouraged the country's state-owned enterprises and other economic actors to go out in search of natural resources to fuel China's continued economic growth. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese relocated throughout the world for work and study. By 2008, China's reputation as an economic heavyweight was established, and further burnished by its strong standing in the midst of the global financial crisis. Changes in the economic realm were matched by reforms in the political sphere. A collective leadership and more institutionalized succession process replaced the highly personalized nature of governance at the top of the political system. Significant political authority was devolved from central to local officials, and China embraced assistance, policy advice, and financial support from the international community. Moreover, as the government retreated from the market, it also retreated from its traditional role as social welfare provider, encouraging private, non-state actors to fill the gap in areas such as education, medical care, and environmental protection. In the mid-1990s, Beijing allowed the establishment of formally approved and registered non-governmental organizations, NGOs, enabling the rapid development of civil society. The advent of the Internet also elevated the role of civil society in Chinese governance. Despite maintaining controls over certain types of political content, by the mid to late 2000s, the web had become a virtual political space with greater transparency, political accountability, and rule of law, in which Chinese citizens use the Internet to investigate crimes, seek justice for victims, and even push to overturn wrongful convictions than existed in the real political system. The era of President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao, 2002 to 2012, also marked the beginning of a more concerted public diplomacy effort. The leadership proclaimed China's win-win philosophy and worked hard to reassure Beijing's neighbors and the rest of the world that China's rise would be peaceful, and as its fortunes grew, so too would those of its partners. In summer 2008, Beijing hosted a world-class Olympic Games that earned accolades internationally and cemented the reputation inside Chinese political circles of the senior official who oversaw preparations for the Games, new Politburo member and rising political star Xi Jinping. The continued strength of the Chinese economy throughout the global financial crisis also introduced a new element into the country's foreign policy. Increasingly, there were calls within China for the country to assume its rightful place on the global stage as a world leader, capable of shaping international norms and institutions. As the United States struggled to climb out of economic recession, senior Chinese economic, military, and foreign policy officials argued that the decline of the United States and the rise of China long predicted to occur at some time during the 21st century, had begun. China's military, the beneficiary of double-digit budget increases for more than a decade, started to grow its ambitions alongside its capabilities. By the late 2000s, the Chinese leadership had progressed from rhetorically staking its claims to maritime sovereignty in the East and South China Seas to using its military prowess to realize them. Sitting at the helm of a small group of senior officials overseeing these moves in the South China Sea was Xi Jinping. China's economic and foreign policy triumphs notwithstanding, by the time of Xi's ascension to power, there was also a growing sense within the country that significant contradictions had emerged in the political and economic life of China. The Communist Party had lost its ideological rationale, and for many of its more than 80 million members, the party served as little more than a stepping stone for personal political and economic advancement. Corruption, an issue that Xi put front and center as he moved up the party ranks, was endemic throughout the party and the economy. And while 3 decades of go-go economic growth had brought significant economic benefits to the Chinese people, Beijing had failed to attend to the need for public goods, such as environmental protection and health care. The social welfare net, dismantled along with many of the state-owned enterprises, had not been fully replaced, and, critically, distribution of social welfare benefits had not kept up with changing work patterns. More than 200 million migrant workers who toiled in the city's factories or construction sites could not legally live, receive medical care, or educate their children in the cities in which they worked. The number of popular protests in the country rose to more than 180,000 by 2010. Even the Chinese economy, while still posting growth rates well beyond those of any other country, began to slow. A few outlier economists in China and the West sounded alarm bells about structural weaknesses. Investment-led growth was taking its toll, contributing to skyrocketing levels of public and corporate debt. And for all its impressive economic gains in low-cost manufacturing, China had little to show in the way of innovation or the development of the service sector, the markers of the world's advanced economies. By the time of Xi's ascension to the top job, despite a number of noteworthy economic and foreign policy achievements, the Hu Jintao era had become known as the Lost Decade. Xi Jinping took power determined to change China's course. Charting a new course. In a 2000 interview in the Chinese journal Zhenghua Ernu, Xi Jinping, then governor of Fujian province, shared his perspective on leadership. A new leader, he stated, needed to continue working on the foundations laid by his predecessor, but at the same time come in with his own plans and set an agenda during the first year. He likened leadership to a relay race, in which a successor has to receive the baton properly and then run it past the line. More than a decade later, at his first press conference in 2012, Xi reiterated the baton analogy, stating that the responsibility of the party leadership is to take over the relay baton passed on to us by history to achieve the great renewal of the Chinese nation. In receiving the baton, however, Xi and his team have set out to run the race differently from their predecessors, with a distinctive new strategy and at an accelerated pace. They've moved away from a collective leadership to elevate Xi as the preeminent leader, deepened the role of the Communist Party and state in society and in the economy, and sought to elevate China's role in world affairs. Not everything is new. Some of the initiatives, such as the heightened attention to corruption within the Communist Party, and more assertive behavior in the South and East China Seas, reflect impulses and tendencies that emerged during the latter stages of Hu's tenure, 2007 to 2012, or even before. Yet Xi and the rest of the Chinese leadership have amplified these efforts in ways that have transformed China's domestic political landscape and its role on the regional and global stage. While provocative actions by China and other claimants in the South China Sea were commonplace, for example, Beijing's massive land reclamation and militarization of the islands in the South China Sea did not begin until 2014. In describing China today, Dean of Peking University's School of International Relations, Jia Xingguo, suggested to me that Xi Jinping had ushered in the third 30 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?